Hello and welcome to my channel. I am BeardedDev. This is a T-SQL tutorial and it's going to be all about pivot. So there are two types of pivot operation. There is many to one, where we take many values, apply an aggregation to those values and just return one result. So we'll be applying an aggregation to the data. And then there is one-to-one, in which case we still use an aggregation, but it is redundant. In that case, all we are simply doing is transferring values from rows to columns. And I'll go through both of these examples shortly. The pivot operation can be broken down into three steps, and they are grouping, spreading, and aggregating. And we'll talk about those a bit more as we go through the examples. If we take a look now at the pivot syntax, as we can see, it's quite extensive. It includes a derived table as an input to our pivot, and then the pivot itself, which includes an aggregate function, the column we're actually aggregating, the spreading element, so that is the row values that are becoming columns, and then our new column names, our target columns. So hopefully this will become apparent when we go through some examples. A key point to note here is we spoke about previously that it does involve grouping, but you'll notice that isn't actually part of the syntax, and when we go through the examples we'll talk about exactly why that is. The main reason for me doing this video is the syntax for pivot has been quite alien to me. I think it's quite different to other elements of or operations in SQL Server. It's been a syntax for me that's hard to remember. I often find myself having to Google how to write a pivot query. Although I understand and have a very good understanding of what the expected results are, I often found myself having to try and remember the syntax. So what I'm going to talk you through is how you can create some sample data yourself to practice, but also the steps I go through to break this process down and make it easier for me to remember. So we're going to go through some simple examples, but they can also be applied with some complex logic. What we're not going to talk about in this video is dynamic pivoting. It's quite an advanced topic, but I will do a video in the future covering dynamic pivoting. Right now, let's head over to SQL Server Management Studio, and first of all we'll get started on creating some sample data, and then we'll go into both examples of many-to-one and one-to-one. And you'll find the scripts for both of those if you wish to follow along in the description below. Now we're in SQL Server Management Studio, and I've got a relatively simple script here. All I'm doing initially is checking if this underlying table LocationSales exists. If it does, I'm going to drop that table. I'm then going to create the table LocationSales, and it's going to have three columns. It's going to have location, which is going to serve as our grouping element. We're going to be using date, which is going to be used as our spreading element. So those are the values in the rows that are going to become our new column values. And then we've got an amount, which is what we're going to aggregate. And underneath that, I've just got a simple insert statement. So I'm from the UK. I've just chosen three cities from the UK: Birmingham, London and Manchester. I've put in some data against some dates, and then we're just going to insert that, and that's going to serve as the source for our pivot examples. So if you wish to try this yourself, we need to think of three things. We need to think of something we can group the data by, something where the rows are going to become columns, which is going to be our spreading element. So date is a particularly good example for that, and you'll see shortly I'm going to just be extracting the year from that to look at an aggregated level. And finally we'll need something to aggregate by. So try and think of other examples you could use. within your data itself. You don't have to create this. You might find this data exists within another table, but just find something you can group by, something you can spread by, which is effectively, you could think of that as another grouping, and then something you can aggregate, such as an amount, a quantity, something along those lines. So we're going to go ahead and execute this query now. And I'll just open a new query window, and initially we'll just start having a look at selecting all columns from the table location sales. So if I go ahead and execute that, we can see in our results grid we've got our locations, we've got some dates which are in date format, and we've got our amount as well. So now what we're going to do, now we've got our sample data to practice with, we're going to go through the steps that I normally follow to enable me to understand the pivot syntax and be able to build on this to write even more complex pivot statements. So those steps are, I'm just going to write them out and number them here. So initially what we want to do is create a derived table. And that's going to serve as the source, the input to our pivot. Then we're going to actually go ahead and create pivot. And then finally step 3 is just going to be creating our select. I'm going to reorder those now to match how we'd write out this query. So our select is actually at the top. And I'm going to use this select all as our initial source. So I'm just going to cut that. I'll hide the results grid for now. And that's going to serve as the source for our derived table. So I'm going to go ahead and select the columns, which are location. And notice I am putting these within square brackets or braces, as location and date are both recognised as keywords in SQL Server. So if I go ahead and execute that query, we've got the same results as before. And what I want to do with date is just simply extract the year. So I'm going to use the year function. I'm just going to give that an alias as year. So if we look at those results now, we can see we've got our location of Birmingham, we've got our year of 2017, and then we've got 2 values. So this is what I was talking about with our many to one example. So we have many amounts against both the location of Birmingham and the year of 2017, and that's the same case for some of the examples. We've got London and different years as well. So that's going to serve as the input. That's going to be our derived table. So now what I like to do is just wrap that within parentheses, and I simply like to indent that as well to make sure that is actually, we can see clearly when we look at the query as a whole that that's something that's effectively a subquery or derived table, whichever term you like. I guess derived table is the correct term for it. But also within here, as long as we are returning a result set that can be passed into pivot, we can do anything we want in here. We can add groupings, we can add joins, we can select from multiple tables, as long as that serves the columns we need for our pivot. So we're then going to go ahead, and what I do within step 2 is I write the keyword pivot, and then we open our parentheses, and this is where we apply our aggregate function. In this case, what I want to return is the location, and then I want the years to become the columns and the aggregated amounts to sit within the values area. So I'm going to say sum amount. So that is, sum is our aggregate function and amount is our aggregate column. And then we're going to write for. So this is where we're actually defining our spreading element now. So our spreading column is year. And then we're going to write in, open parentheses again. And now we're going to indicate the target column values. So within my derived table, I'll just quickly demonstrate. I have the different values 2017, 2018, 2019 and 2020, and they are going to be the new columns. So as they're integer values, I also wrap those within square brackets or braces or parentheses. So I'm just going to write those out there, and then I'm going to close that in. So these are my target columns, and then year is my spreading element. So I'm just going to close the pivot, and I'm just going to alias that as P for pivot. Now we can see building the query this way, we are going to get some red squiggly lines to indicate that SQL Server doesn't understand what we're trying to do. And that's fine at this stage. I would expect that to happen. I'm writing out this query as I understand it rather than how a machine would understand it. And then the final part, step 3, is we're going to create our select. So I'm going to write the keyword select, and I'm going to select location. And location is important within this query. I'm just going to zoom out slightly so we can see that all within one window. So location is important because it's part of our derived table but not part of our pivot, and that is actually our grouping column. So how this works is any columns that are part of the derived table here that are not part of the pivot, here we can see amount and year, SQL Server recognises those as grouping columns, so it understands that that's what we want to group by. And then we're going to write out again our new column names, which are going to be the year values, 2019 and 2020. And then we're also going to write from, as we want to select from the derived table as the input to pivot. And we can see there now, looking through that query, I'll just zoom out again so I can get that all on one page. Looking through that query, we can see that we now have no red squiggly lines. SQL Server now understands, the machine understands what we're actually trying to achieve. So if we go ahead and execute that query, we can see our results grid here. So it has grouped by location. There's now one row for each location. Our year values have now become columns, and then our amounts have been aggregated into the results area. And we can also see, what's interesting to note here is when there are no values, so London doesn't have any amount values for 2017, that would automatically, a null will automatically be added for us. So I'll just hide the results grid and zoom in again. So within this select as well, there's a few things to note. We don't have to select all of our new columns, so we could just select location 2017 and 2018 as demonstrated here. However, that would be a waste because we're actually doing the work to create those additional columns here, but it can be ideal for testing. Another note is that we don't have to add all of the values. So if year included, say, 20 different values, but we only wanted to look at the last 3 years, we don't have to add all of those values in here. So I could save that work and actually just indicate that those are the only years that I'm interested in. An important note is if you do have a lot of values and you might be here typing out, you know, up to 50, 100 or even more values that you want to pivot by, then you probably do want to go down the route of looking into how to do that dynamically, how to return those values dynamically. Like I say, that's quite an advanced topic that we won't cover in this video, but I will look to do in the future. So that is a good example of a many to one. So we're taking, in this case, many amounts from our derived table, and we're returning one result for each location and year. We're now going to go on to have a look at a one-to-one, which is just simply transferring from rows to columns. So we'll have a look at how to do that. Again, we'll use as a starting point, just select all from LocationSales. And I will again write out my steps. I don't actually write out these steps as comments, but it can be helpful to start with. So the first step is always create derived table that serves as our input. Second step, create pivot. Third step, create select. So we'll see in this demonstration a few differences compared to the many-to-one example. So again, I'll just drop that under there, and I will move the step 3 to the top. So now we're going to create our derived table, and we're actually going to be using our derived table. I thought this was a good idea to show you how you can apply manipulation in this input, and the results of the derived table are determining whether it's one-to-one or many-to-one. So in this case, we are doing a one-to-one example, which means we're going to apply some grouping within the derived table itself, which we're going to do now. So we're just going to go ahead and write out. So again, we want to extract the year from date. And in this case, we're going to be summing our amounts within the derived table. So it's not going to be happening within the pivot, it's going to be happening within the input to the pivot. And as we're aggregating, we need to indicate what we are grouping by. And in this case, we need to add our year function as well to the group by. So we'll go ahead and execute this query. So we can see here we've got a lot smaller amount of values. I'll just show you that. So there's our query there, we're grouping by location and year date. So we have a lot smaller values. In this case, we only have one amount for each year and location. And that's what's going to be serving as the input. So we now continue as normal, wrap within parentheses, and I like to indent with a tab just to indicate that is a sub part of the query. And then as normal, we're going to go ahead and create our pivot. Let's write the keyword pivot. And this is where the difference between many-to-one and one-to-one really applies. So we have to use an aggregate function, but the aggregate function doesn't actually mean anything. It's not going to be grouping data together. As we're using integer or numeric values here, we could use sum again, but it wouldn't be, there's only one value, so it would just be summing one value, which would always be the same result. But typically what is used is max or min. So in this case, we're going to use max. I'm going to say max amount. So that's our aggregate function and aggregate column. And again, we're going to be applying this for year. That's going to be in, and then our new column values again, 2019 and 2020. So max can also be applicable. So pivoting may not just be for numeric values. If you have a generic table in SQL, which is typically done where you have a different number of attributes, you might use a generic table and it will have an attribute name and then the value. So you can also pivot strings as well, and that's where max would typically be used. And we'll alias our pivot as P, and then we'll go ahead and create our final select. So again, we'll select the location, which is our grouping column, and then our values, our new column names that we have created, which in this case represent years. And then always remember to write from, So we're going from our derived table, which serves as input to pivot. We go ahead and execute that, and we should have exactly the same results as our earlier example. I've taken off a couple of the years, so I'll just add those back in. Yep, so we've got exactly the same results for both queries. The difference between the two comes from how we pass in the input within the derived table. So in this case we're just passing one value per location and year, and in the previous example, the many to one, we're passing in many values per location and year and doing the aggregation within Pivot itself. Really hope you have enjoyed that video. Like I say, if you want to follow along, I will copy the code into the description below. But I thought I'd just end on a question, which is what operations are performed when pivoting data? Post your answers in the comments below. Also, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to hit that like button, or if you'd like me to do anything different, let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and check out my other videos. Thanks a lot for watching.